Trent Horn recently put out a video titled as a response to Dan McClellan, but watch what happens in the first few minutes.
First, Dan's work shows why Christians need to be aware of biblical scholarship and shouldn't be anti-intellectual. Some people think scholarship is identical with polemics or arguments against Christianity, which isn't true because some scholarship, even critical scholarship, supports key elements of the Christian faith. For example, as Bart Ehrman notes in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, it's the opinion of virtually every expert on the planet that Jesus existed. Now, many of these experts deny Jesus was God or deny certain historical aspects of his life, but they at least agree Christianity's origins lie with an itinerant preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. Mythicism, in contrast, is a fringe view which says Jesus never existed at all, and proponents of this view often act like photo-negatives of religious apologists. In their zeal to defend atheism, they end up using bad arguments just because they like the argument's conclusions. One example would be the unhistorical claim that Jesus was simply copied from the lives of pagan deities, a claim I've debunked and addressed in a previous episode. Dan has also criticized mythicism and also addresses other bizarre religious conspiracy theories, like that the Star of David is a satanic image or that the Pope's hat is a symbol of the pagan god Dagon.
Before Trent says a single word about Dan's actual arguments, he pivots to mythicism. He brings up Jesus' existence, cites Bart Ehrman.
Some people think scholarship is identical with polemics or arguments against Christianity, which isn't true because some scholarship, even critical scholarship, supports key elements of the Christian faith. For example, as Bart Ehrman notes in his book, Did Jesus Exist?, it's the opinion of virtually every expert on the planet that Jesus existed.
And immediately establishes common ground with Dan on the historicity of Jesus. And that's not by accident. That's a strategy. Trent is signaling to his Christian audience. See, even the critical scholars agree with us on this. Dan and I are on the same team here. It's a way of softening what comes next, making Dan's more challenging arguments feel less threatening by first drawing him into the fold on an easier question. And it's a way of letting Christians walk away thinking mainstream scholarship is friendlier to their faith than it actually is. Now, during this section of Trent's video, a few clips of my work pop up.
Jesus never existed at all, and proponents of this view often act like photo-negative.
Clips of me with Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Robert Price, as Trent dismisses mythicism as fringe and driven by anti-religious zeal. So I feel like Trent invited me to this conversation, and I'm happy to accept. So here I am. I should mention that Trent and I aren't strangers. I hosted a debate on my channel between Trent Horn and Gavin Ortlund on one side, both apologists, and doctors Kip Davis and Joshua Bowen on the other, over slavery in the Bible. And that debate revealed something important about how Trent operates. During the exchange, Trent made the argument that the Bible's allowance, get this, the allowance of 6 years of indentured servitude was actually morally superior to Hammurabi's code, which only prescribed 3 years, half the time. His reasoning? In the ancient world, slavery kept people from starving, and the slave master was required to provide for them. So, by that logic, 6 years of enslavement is more moral than 3 because you get fed longer.
This brings up, I guess, a broader point for me. In this sort of progressive or incremental movement view, how many counterexamples does it take for it to not work in your minds? In other words, if I could show you a case, a pretty clear case, where an ancient Near Eastern law collection seems to be better and the Hebrew Bible makes it worse, what would that mean, if anything?
Yeah, it would tip the scales.
The reason that I asked that question is this seems very like it could, if the premise here is that God is moving, like making regulations to make slavery a little bit better, it seems really problematic if he makes some of it worse. Like, what would be the rationale for him making it worse?
Well, I don't think you've given an example yet of it being made worse. Just one example it's missing legislation that could make it better, like challenging.
In the laws of Hammurabi 117, right? Debt slavery, you can only keep a debt slave for 3 years, right? They have to be released in the fourth. In both Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, it's 6 years. So, so then the question would be: is it better or worse to serve as a slave for longer?
Well, Gavin may have some thoughts on this. I don't know. I have a thought on this. The answer is it depends. So John Goldingay is an Old Testament scholar, and some of his thoughts on the difference there, that it may be the case that it's harsher but more realistic. So on the face of it, it does seem worse to say that the debt bondage is 6 years instead of 3 years. But imagine you passed a law saying that people that forgive the strained analogy with the best we can do in the modern world, that there's a lot of people in mortgage debt slavery. I got a Fannie Mae, I got to pay my mortgage, and it's just a lot to deal with. What if we passed a law is saying that we're capping mortgages at 15 years instead of 30 years to alleviate people and not have them be under that burden so much? One could say that that's better for people, unless there's unintended consequences, like, for example, the mortgage it's more onerous to undertake, or people aren't as willing to take out loans. Banks are not as willing to offer the loans because they're riskier and they don't know if they'll get paid back. And the comparison there would be, it may be a case that the Hebrew length is longer, because if you shorten the debt slave, why not, instead of 3 years, why not 1 year? Why not half a year? Well, suddenly a master may be hesitant to want to take on someone who wants to sell themselves into debt slavery because their crops failed, they have nothing, and the people who can take on debt slaves may say, well, I'm worried in this short amount of time, maybe I'll get repaid, maybe I won't through their labor. And so if you shorten it enough, it's about a balancing act between those who will seek out relief through something like debt slavery and those willing to take on the risk of housing and providing for someone in this sort of servitude, while also trying to get back the same amount of value in labor. So I think that is something that some scholars have considered in seeing the difference between the two.
Dr. Joshua Bowen has said to me countless times, if Hammurabi's code had said 6 years and the Bible had said 3, though it's the other way around, Trent would have pointed out that the biblical slavery was half the time, making it morally superior. And I can't disagree with Dr. Bowen. This is what apologetics does. The conclusion is fixed. The arguments flex to get there. And I see the same pattern in this video when Trent handles mythicism, scholarship, and the historical Jesus. Let me be upfront. I'm not a mythicist. I think there probably was a historical figure behind the Jesus tradition, but I used to be a mythicist, and I changed my mind. So I understand the arguments from the inside, and I have to say something about the way Trent and apologists like him treat this question, because honestly, it's dishonest. Trent frames it as a binary. Either you're with the scholars who say Jesus existed, or you're fringe, conspiracy theorist, on par with people who think the Star of David is a satanic symbol.
Dan has also criticized mythicism and also addresses other bizarre religious conspiracy theories, like that the Star of David is a satanic image, or that the Pope's hat is a symbol of the pagan god Dagon.
And that is a false dichotomy, and it's designed to shut down a conversation, not to engage with it. Think about who is doing dismissing here. The people looking down their noses at mythicists are the same people who believe a Jewish peasant was born of a virgin, walked on water, multiplied bread and fish, died for 3 days, physically rose from the dead, and then floated up into the clouds, and is coming back someday to destroy and remake the entire world. And they think the people questioning whether this figure existed are the silly ones. Really? The only reason mythicism even exists as a position is because the evidence for Jesus' existence is not that great. Our earliest source, Paul, never met an earthly Jesus. He describes a revelatory encounter with the risen Christ. The Gospels were written decades after the alleged events by anonymous authors who were not eyewitnesses. There are no contemporary accounts of Jesus during his lifetime. No Roman records, no mentions by any historian writing while he was supposedly alive. The first non-Christian reference is Josephus, writing around 93 of the Common Era, and even that passage is widely acknowledged to contain later Christian interpolation. There's a debate. The evidence is thin, and that's just the reality. And pretending the question is absurd doesn't make the evidence better. Now, do I think some mythicists online can be radical and dogmatic? Sure. Some of them are fundamentalist wearing skeptic masks. They've just traded one set of unquestionable conclusions for another. But the category itself, the idea that Jesus may not have existed as a historical person, should not be treated as taboo. Real serious academics have historically questioned Jesus' historicity. Bruno Bauer, Arthur Drews, G.A. Wells, and more recently, Dr. Richard Carrier, who published a peer-reviewed monograph on the subject through Sheffield Phoenix Press, and Dr. Robert Price, a credentialed New Testament scholar who has argued the position extensively. You can disagree with them, no problem, but acting like the question itself is illegitimate is not scholarship. It's gatekeeping. Now, I do want to be fair here to Trent. He does acknowledge some of what critical scholars say. He mentions that many experts deny Jesus was God or deny certain historical aspects of his life. He's not completely hiding the ball, but he doesn't go deep into it either. He touches it just enough to look informed and then moves on. He never sits with what those conclusions actually mean for his theology. He never tells his audience that Ehrman, the very scholar he's citing, argues Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish preacher who believed God was about to intervene in history within that generation, that Jesus did not claim to be God, did not perform actual miracles, was not born of a virgin, did not physically rise from the dead. Ehrman considers the resurrection appearances to be visionary experiences, not historical events. Trent grazes the surface of this and just keeps on walking. And this is a pattern. Apologists love to invoke Bart Ehrman as a weapon against other skeptics. Dr. Richard C. Miller has actually coined a term for this on my channel. He said it during an interview. Argumentum ad Bartum.
I want to point this out too. As much as I like Bart, and I do like Bart Ehrman, I'm a fan. I do think that I do want to criticize the field,
Please.
though. Yeah. So what I call argumentum ad Bartum. Basically, Bart ends up becoming a backstop for all rational discussion in the field. Anything beyond him, it basically comes up in, I've seen it too many times, where even Bart Ehrman thinks that the Gospels are, this line of argumentation is hogwash. It's fallacious from top to bottom.
It's this move where apologists wave Ehrman around like a trump card. Even Bart Ehrman says Jesus existed, as if that settles the conversation. But Bart is a skeptic himself. He's not on Trent's team. Bart's conclusions about Jesus dismantle virtually every distinctive Christian truth claim Trent holds. Using Ehrman to shut down inquiry is a fallacy, and it doesn't stop anyone from taking mythicism or deep skepticism about the Gospels into serious consideration. My own understanding of the problems in the New Testament have been sharpened, literally sharpened enormously by engaging with mythicist arguments over the years, even though I ultimately came to a different conclusion. So here's the bait and switch. Trent takes the minimal scholarly concession some guy probably existed and presents it in a way that lets his audience feel like scholarship is on their side. But the Jesus those scholars reconstruct has almost nothing in common with the Jesus Trent worships. The historical Jesus of mainstream scholarship is not the second person of the Trinity. He's not the miracle-working Son of God. He's a failed apocalyptic prophet who predicted the imminent end of the world and was wrong. That's the consensus. Trent just doesn't dwell on that part. And I can't help but feel that Trent's slam of mythicists serves a larger purpose. It lets scholars who don't buy the apologist framework think they have common ground with people like Trent. So what if they agree there was a guy? That argument is literally paper thin, and everything built on top of it is where the real disagreement lies. Let's grant it. There was a historical Galilean preacher. Fine. What does that actually get Christianity? Because the moment you open the Gospels, you are wading through myth, legend, and theological invention. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as the scholarly description of what this literature is. The birth narratives, Matthew and Luke, contradict each other on nearly every detail. Matthew has magi, a star, a massacre of infants, and a flight to Egypt, modeled on Moses' typology. Luke has shepherds, a census that didn't happen the way he describes it, and a manger. These are not history. They are theological prologues designed to present Jesus as the fulfillment of Israelite expectation. Raymond Brown, one of the most respected Catholic New Testament scholars of the 20th century, said this plainly in The Birth of the Messiah, his book. Even he, a Catholic priest, acknowledged the infancy narratives cannot be treated as straightforward history. The miracles, walking on water, multiplying loaves, raising the dead, these motifs have direct parallels in the Elijah-Elisha cycle and Hellenistic divine man traditions. The feeding of 5,000 echoes Elisha feeding 100 men in 2 Kings 4. Jesus walking on water parallels divine sea-crossing motifs found throughout ancient Near Eastern and Greco-Roman literature. These are not incidental similarities. They are the literary architecture of the Gospels. The Passion narrative. Scholars like John Dominic Cross and Raymond Brown have demonstrated that the Passion accounts are saturated with Psalm 22 and Isaiah 53, not because those texts predicted Jesus, but because the earliest Christians constructed the narrative using those scriptural templates. The casting of lots, the vinegar, the cry of abandonment. These are scriptural allusions stitched into a theological narrative. Dennis MacDonald has shown that Mark's gospel also draws heavily on Homeric epic tradition. This is myth-making, sophisticated, deliberate myth-making. And even if you don't follow Dennis MacDonald's cue, consensus scholars in the critical thinking world see the literary imitation of scripture from the Septuagint, even in Mark. Then we have the resurrection, our earliest source. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 never describes an empty tomb. He lists appearances using the Greek word ophthe, language used for divine visions, not physical encounters. The empty tomb first appears in Mark, written around 70 of the Common Era, maybe later, 4 decades at least after the alleged event. And Mark's original ending has no resurrection appearances at all, just an empty tomb and terrified women who say nothing. Matthew, Luke, and John then each construct dramatically different and contradictory appearance traditions. The trajectory from Paul's visions to John's doubting Thomas is a trajectory of legendary growth, not historical memory. This is what Trent fundamentally misunderstands, or at least refuses to engage with. The real threat to his theology is not mythicism. It's mythologization. You don't need to deny that a historical Jesus existed to recognize that virtually everything Christians believe about him is the product of theological development, literary invention, and mythological embellishment built up over decades and centuries after his death. And this is why the mythicism debate is ultimately a distraction from the more important conversation, whether Jesus existed or not. The Gospels are myth-laden documents. The Christ of faith was constructed from Jewish scripture, Hellenistic religious categories, and the broader conceptual world of the ancient Mediterranean. And it's not just the mythological framework. Think about the fact that scholars can't even agree on what kind of historical figure Jesus was if he existed. The dominant model in scholarship is the apocalyptic prophet, championed by Schweitzer, Ehrman, Allison, and others. But there's also the zealot model, Jesus as a political revolutionary or violent rebel, argued by S.G.F. Brandon and more recently by Reza Aslan. And here's what's really interesting. Robert M. Price, who is a minimal mythicist, has said the zealot model is actually the most plausible reconstruction if there was a historical Jesus. Richard Carrier, meanwhile, has suggested that if there was a historical Jesus, he likely committed to what you might call a death by cop scenario, knowingly provoking the authorities, understanding he would be killed, and purposefully martyring himself, Think of Ignatius's letter to the Romans. So even among those who grant historicity, the figure behind the tradition looks radically different depending on which scholar you ask. Some see an apocalyptic preacher. Some see a political insurgent. Some see a deliberate martyr. Some even see a cynic sage. The fact that scholars can't agree on what Jesus was, even after 2 centuries of historical Jesus research, should tell you something about how little we actually know. Trent dismisses the idea that Jesus was copied from pagan deities, as though that's the scholarly argument. It's not. That's zeitgeist. Nobody in serious scholarship is making that argument. What scholars like Trygve Mettinger, Jonathan Z. Smith, Dag Inso, and Paola Corrente have shown is that the categories used to interpret Jesus, a dying God who descends and is exalted, whose followers participate ritually in his death and resurrection, these categories existed in the Mediterranean world well before Christianity arrived. Early Christians did not invent resurrection theology in a vacuum. They drew on the conceptual toolkit available to them. I don't need to beat a dead horse. I've done extensive work on this on my channel with primary sources and interviews with scholars, and the evidence is substantial. And it goes beyond dying and rising God patterns. Dr. Richard C. Miller has done groundbreaking work showing how the gospel resurrection and ascension narratives fit squarely within Greco-Roman translation fable conventions. These are stories where heroes vanish from their tombs and are taken up to the divine realm. M. David Litwa has demonstrated extensively how the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus, his miraculous birth, his transfiguration, his post-mortem appearances, mirrors the literary conventions used for divine men and deified rulers across the ancient Mediterranean. And I can't leave out Robin Faith Walsh. She has argued that the Gospel authors were not community scribes recording oral traditions, but educated Greco-Roman literary craftsmen composing creative literature using the tools and conventions of their literary culture. When you put all of this together, the picture is clear. The Christ of the Gospels was built using the literary and mythological building blocks of the ancient world. Trent urges Christians not to be anti-intellectual and to engage with scholarship. Great. I agree. But here's the irony. When you actually follow the scholarship where it leads, when you read Ehrman, Crossan, Fredrickson, Allison, Goodacre, Hurtado, Miller, Litwa, Walsh, etc., many others, you don't arrive at Roman Catholicism. You arrive at a picture of Christian origins that is deeply, profoundly human. A charismatic Jewish preacher, or maybe a political rebel, depending on who you ask, was executed. His followers had experiences they interpreted through the lens of resurrection. And then over decades and centuries, they built an increasingly elaborate mythological, liturgical, and institutional structure around that event, drawing freely from Jewish scripture and the wider cultural world. That's not me being polemical. That is the mainstream scholarly picture. And if we factor in Richard C. Miller's hypothesis about this, you may not even need to act like there were real visionary experiences that need to be invoked in order for the origin of the cult to arise. Think of Mormonism. Did Joseph Smith really have all these actual visions? Or was he making stuff up as he went and constructing a cult using prior templates and ideas? I mean, there are many ways to approach the origins of Christianity, and it doesn't need to only be visionary or hallucination models. I really think his view needs to be put on the table. Now, I want to walk you through something because I think it reveals the entire framework Trent is operating within. And he shows it to you himself if you're paying attention. At around the 2-minute 54 mark, Trent identifies himself as a Catholic.
And as a Catholic, I agree with Dan when he points out,
fine. But then at 5 minutes and 9 seconds, he says something very telling.
That's silly because all reading involves interpretation, a fact which shows why it would make sense that if God revealed himself, then he might leave an interpretive authority along with the written words in his revelation.
He says that all reading involves interpretation, and then adds that this fact shows why it would make sense that if God revealed himself, he might leave an interpretive authority. That's the Catholic magisterium. He's smuggling in the authority of the Catholic Church as the logical conclusion of biblical interpretation in a video that it's supposed to be about engaging fairly with scholarship. He's not asking a question, he's planting a conclusion. Then throughout the middle of the video, Trent praises Dan McClellan every time Dan's arguments happen to line up with Catholic positions over Protestant ones. The canon discussion, the correction on "it is finished" in Greek to telestai, the John 3:16 translation issue, Trent highlights all of it, not because he's following the data, because the data happens to be useful to him in that moment. When scholarship agrees with Rome, Trent celebrates it. When it doesn't, he has an escape hatch already built. And that escape hatch comes at 21 minutes, 53 seconds.
But where Dan and I would disagree is that I do believe there are some genuine dogmas. If Christ did rise from the dead and establish a church that teaches with his authority, then that church has the ability, in some instances, to teach without error what God revealed to humanity. In those cases, no data can refute those dogmas, and no such data exists.
This is where Trent says the quiet part out loud. He says, if Christ rose from the dead and established a church that teaches with his authority, then that church can teach without error. And he says, I want you to hear this clearly. In those cases, no data can refute those dogmas, and no such data exists.
If Christ did rise from the dead and establish a church that teaches with his authority, then that church has the ability, in some instances, to teach without error what God revealed to humanity. In those cases,
no data can refute those dogmas, and no such data exists.
That is his actual position. No data can refute his beliefs. He has decided the conclusion before examining the evidence. That is the textbook definition of dogmatism, and what scholars like Joshua Bowen and others I've spoke to for years say is the textbook definition of Christian apologetics. So let's trace the arc of this video. At 2 minutes 54 seconds, he tells you he's Catholic. At 5 minutes 9 seconds, he tells you an interpretive authority is needed, meaning his church. In the middle, he selectively praises scholarship that supports Catholic positions. And at 21 minutes 53 seconds, he tells you no evidence can overturn what his church teaches. That is not a man following the data. That is a man who started with his conclusion and built an entire video around making it look like scholarship supports it. The whole thing is an exercise in motivated reasoning, presenting an intellectual humility. And many of his viewers are just going to eat this up. And then he ends by flipping Dan's motto, data over dogma, and telling you to follow data from Catholic scholars like Brant Petrie, John Bergsma, and Scott Hahn.
At the very least, I think Dan would agree with me that you should not take what he says as dogma. Just consider it data and use it alongside other data in your pursuit of truth, like data from Catholic biblical scholars like Brant Petrie, John Bergsma, or Scott Hahn, or moderate scholars even like Daniel Harrington.
Think about that. His answer to data over dogma is follow the data that comes from scholars who already agree with my dogma. That's not following data over dogma. That's curating data to protect your dogma. And here's what makes this even more telling. Sure, go read Petrie, Bergsma, and Hahn. But Trent, why don't you also tell your audience to read the other Catholic scholars, the critical ones? Why not recommend John P. Meyer, a Catholic priest whose 5-volume A Marginal Jew sharply separates the historical Jesus from the Christ of faith, concludes that only 4 parables can be confidently attributed to the historical Jesus, and calls the virgin birth obscure from the historical point of view. Pope Benedict XVI himself called Meyer's work a model of historical critical exegesis. Why not recommend Raymond Brown, the Catholic priest whose The Birth of the Messiah acknowledged the infancy narratives are not straightforward history? Why not recommend Joseph Fitzmyer, the Jesuit, who is one of the most rigorous critical Pauline and Lucan scholars of the 20th century? Why not Hans Kung, the Catholic theologian who had his license to teach revoked by the Vatican for questioning papal infallibility? Because those Catholic scholars, Trent's own people, would undermine his case. The Catholic scholarly tradition is not monolithic. There are Catholic priests and scholars who have done rigorous critical historical work on the New Testament, and their conclusions look nothing like what Petrie and Hahn are selling. Trent knows these scholars exist. He just doesn't want you reading them. He wants you reading the apologists, not the historians. So when he says, follow the data, what he really means is follow my data, the data I've pre-selected, the data that leads back to Rome. I say read them all and pick them all apart. I respect Trent's right to believe whatever he wants, but you cannot walk into a conversation about biblical scholarship, praise the value of intellectual engagement, and then declare your religious commitments are beyond the reach of evidence. You can't have it both ways. Either you follow the data wherever it leads, or you admit that at some point faith overrides evidence. Both of those are coherent positions, but pretending you're doing the first while actually doing the second, that's exactly the kind of thing people see through. And it's why channels like mine and Dan's continue to grow. And I want to say something directly to Trent's audience. If Trent is going to cite scholars like Ehrman, he owes you the full picture of what those scholars conclude, not just the one sentence that sounds friendly to his theology, because the rest of Ehrman's body of work systematically dismantles the very Christology Trent is defending. Read the scholars Trent cites. Read them in full, and then decide for yourself whether mainstream scholarship supports Christianity or undermines it. Again, I'm not a mythicist. I think there was probably a historical figure behind the tradition. But that concession gives Christianity almost nothing, because the Jewish Jesus of history and the Christ of faith are two very different figures, and the gap between them is filled with decades of mythological development, theological creativity, and literary invention. Understanding that, really sitting with it, is one of the most important steps you can take in thinking critically about where religion actually comes from. Some scholars, and I love these academics, say the historical Jesus actually gets in the way of the theology of the authors themselves over and over, where they have to strip away the real dude in order to give you the embellished theological version. Go read those academics. Trent, you showed my clips. You showed my work with Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Price. You invited me to this conversation whether you meant to or not. So here I am. And my challenge to you is simple. Sit down with me. Come on, MythVision. Let's have this conversation face to face. Because I think your audience deserves to hear what happens when someone actually pushes back on these arguments in real time. It could be a friendly dialogue. I've seen you have excellent conversations with other people like Alex O'Connor. I really, really hope that you don't take offense to what I said to here. I could understand why you might feel a little bit offended by it, but I'm trying to be as honest and point out what I see from my point of view. And at the end of the day, I do invite you for a conversation of challenging ideas together and reasoning through these texts and why the scholarship does think the way they do. It'd be really an interesting dialogue, a friendly one at that, if you're interested. I'm not interested in, trying to bash each other or anything like that. As you've met me before, I hosted the debate with you and those other academics. But I do think that there are some flaws in this thought process. So let me know if we can make that happen. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is MythVision. I'm Derek Lambert, and I'll see you in the next one. Never forget, we are MythVision.